Beyond the gates, spoilers teased that the moment of truth was quieter than anyone expected, that intimacy and confession arrived on the same breath as a promise. It began, in their version of the tale, with a ring in a pocket, a mother's well-meaning push, and a man who had been hoarding a secret like a coin he was ashamed to spend. Derek had been keeping the small proofs of his body's protest hidden from the people he loved, the tiny, electric shivers that ran up his shin at 3 in the morning, the sudden heat and then numbness like a tide reversing itself under skin. He had told her, for months, that his leg was a dead thing, that hope was a dangerous currency. He had said it because he feared becoming a charity case in the eyes of someone he adored more than himself. Ashley planned the proposal the way you plan the last of something precious, with a trembling certainty, a script refined until the words felt right to her own mouth. Her mother, Jan, had said the words that pressed the idea into her hands: don't let pity be the reason you stay. Don't let the fact that he was hurt be the reason you stay. If you love him, show him you love him for him. That single line had set her mind afire. It had made sense in a way that made her heart feel steady for the first time in weeks, as though saying yes aloud would rearrange the world into something safer and truer. She did it in the small kitchen where they had learned to make space for each other among the medical bottles and mobility aids, the late-night takeout boxes, the stack of therapy books. The overhead light was merciless and honest. Derek sat in his chair, the one with the cushion that had molded itself to his form, watching her with a look that had become familiar, a combination of warmth and a guardedness that had nothing to do with cages or wheels and everything to do with what he chose to reveal. Ashley's hands were steady when she reached into her pocket, but her voice trembled. "Derek," she said, and he knew it was coming, though the timing surprised him, that quick, disarming bravery that makes the world tilt. "Will you marry me?" For a beat he said nothing. His silence was not the blank of disinterest, it was a tight, compressed thing, the result of years of rehearsing what not to say. He had been pretending that his body was beyond repair, that the idea of walking again was sentimental and naive. He had not said it because he feared that telling the truth that he had started to feel, in small staccato flashes, the tremor of nerve reawakening, would reframe everything. If she married him on the belief that he would never walk, he feared the shame of that pity would follow them into the cathedral and into the bedroom and into the quiet hours when love needs more than sentiment to survive. So he sat and let the silence stretch until it was large enough to breathe in. Finally, he confessed. The confession was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no thunderclaps, no raised voices. It was the soft, terrible honesty of someone dropping a raw truth on a table that had already learned to hold heavy things. "I've been feeling things," he said. "Not much. Not enough to stand on. But there are nights when my foot twitches like it remembers something. When I wake, there's warmth where there used to be only stone. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel sorry. I didn't want you to marry me out of that." Ashley, who had imagined every possible version of this moment, the hopeful, the hurt, the quietly solemn, felt like someone had pulled the air out of her lungs and then handed it back with trembling fingers. For a moment she did not move. There was a very small, human panic, not the heart-shattering kind but the kind that makes you reach for a hand you hadn't been sure you needed. She thought, very briefly, that perhaps she had misread everything. Maybe his silence meant he didn't want the life she wanted for them. Maybe he would refuse. Maybe she had stepped into a story he was not ready to share. But Derek's next words closed the gap. He told her that his silence had been about fear of being accepted because of what he had become rather than for who he was. He told her he had lied by omission, that he had let her believe his body was unchanging because he wanted her to love him on his terms, not from pity. The honesty came like a small act of mercy. He did not beg forgiveness. Instead, he offered the truth as a foundation upon which they might build something steadier than the scaffolding of sympathy. "I didn't want the lie to be what our life was built on," he said. "I don't want your kindness to be guilt wearing a dress." Ashley listened to the way his voice carried. She let each syllable anchor her. She thought of Jan's hands clasped over hers at breakfast, the way her mother had told her that love must be chosen, not born out of compulsion. She remembered the nights when she had watched Derek fall asleep and traced the outline of his jaw as though memorizing a map. She thought of the small, private ways he had changed his jokes, his stubborn refusal to let her carry everything alone, the way he learned to plan his day around her laughter. It was not pity she felt, she realized. Her pressure was not the quick twitch of sympathy but the slow, deliberate pull of someone who could not imagine life unloaded of him. When she said yes, it was not a concession but a claim. She let the ring slip onto his finger with a smile that had courage at its center. "I know," she said. "I know it's not pity. I want to be with you. I want to marry you because you are you." In that moment, something in Derek's posture loosened, the shoulders that had held shame softened, and there was the beginning of an almost cautious hope in his eyes. He told her, truthfully now, about the tingling in his leg, about the therapy sessions that sometimes felt like miracles and sometimes like cruelty. He told her about mornings when he stood at the window and imagined a step and then another and the vastness of the world returning. Jan, when she heard the news, allowed herself a full-throated happiness that had been held back by months of fear. To a mother who had watched her daughter live with a careful optimism, a woman who had rung Derek's name like a bell and who had been present at every hospital wing and consultation, this was not merely a romantic victory. It felt like a vindication of all the tiny kindnesses and tireless evenings of conversation and the steadying platitudes that sometimes work like glue. Jan said aloud what she had not dared say. It was wonderful to see her child happy. She felt something like relief pour through her. The proposal had, in its own quiet way, declared that Ashley's love was hers to give on her own terms. But beneath that happiness lay a nervousness that would not be spoken of immediately, those unattended questions that gossip and fear like to feed on. If Derek had been experiencing sensations, what did that mean for the future? Would therapy continue to heal? Could he walk? Could their marriage be a partnership built on a receding injury? Or did the truth mean a future neither of them could fully script? Even as Jan smiled, she harbored a practical shadow. The world does not simply realign for love, it bends at the mercy of economics, of doctors' opinions, of the rawness of human will set against the stubbornness of the body. While love decided to be brave in one apartment, another relationship was unraveling in a casino glow on the other side of town. There was a different language there, the hum of slot machines, the clinking of chips, the smoke-streaked lights that gave everything a feverish edge. It was here that Doug's humiliation came to be staged with a cruel, almost theatrical clarity. He had been married to Vanessa for years, a union threaded with small kindnesses and larger resentments. Doug had stability in his life, or at least the appearance of it, a job, a pride, a set of obligations he had learned to move through like a man walking a familiar route. He had a debt, too, that had been accumulating like an unspoken weather pattern, drawing lightning without warning. One night, he saw Vanessa with Joey. They were together at the baccarat table, leaning into each other's conversation with that intimate anonymity lovers have in public. Joey, the kind of man whose charm always seemed just a degree too polished, who carried risk like cologne, was there as if he belonged to the smoke and the clamor. Vanessa laughed, and Doug, who knew the shape of his wife's laugh as intimately as a map, felt his stomach drop. He watched them from the periphery and then, propelled by a mixture of fear and the compulsion to know, he approached. What he did not anticipate was Vanessa's reaction. Instead of guilt, there was a brittle, almost annoyed glare. She treated him as an inconvenience, a man who had stepped into a scene where he no longer had a role. The humiliation lodged deep, because public shame is a pressure that bends a person inward. He expected perhaps tears or anger, some explanation that would either mend or tear more deliberately. Vanessa's coldness, however, felt like an erasure, and Doug staggered under it as if struck. She spoke to him with a clipped resolution that cut more painfully than any raised voice. "I'm done," she said, as if reciting a plan. She didn't beg for explanation, didn't linger on the edges of what had been. She had, in that moment, decided that the life she had shared with Doug had been paid for in other currencies, small, repeated sacrifices that had started to feel like submission. She had been covering his debt. The confession was delivered not as an apology but as a statement of fact. She was the one who had been paying off the pieces he could not bear to look at, and she had been doing it because she wanted to, or perhaps because she had been trapped into doing so. Now she wanted out. Doug felt the ground tilt beneath him. His shame was not only for the betrayal he was witnessing but for the humiliation of learning that the woman who had been at his side had been underwriting his failures. To hear that Vanessa had been covering his debts was to hear, in a sense, that she had been the keeper of his dignity while it quietly eroded. It made him feel both small and enraged. A dangerous blend. He wanted to argue that she could not simply walk away after such years of promises. He also, beneath the roar, felt loss and bewilderment. He had not known she felt this trapped, and the discovery was more devastating than any blunt object. Joey, who watched the scene unfurl like a chess player observing moves, said something that introduced a new layer of tension. In a voice that was carefully composed, he advised Vanessa to go back to Doug, a suggestion that, superficially, read like the counsel of someone who wanted peace. But his eyes carried something else, an awareness that the pull between two people is a lever that can be used. He stepped into the triangle with a posture that was both protective and predatory. A man who knew the power in being the alternative and who also recognized the utility of appearing honorable. He told Vanessa that the night was not the place for a decision and that perhaps she should take time. Their hands near enough to be mistaken for a single silhouette. The tension, for Doug, tasted like impotence. He felt the old, familiar knot of pride tighten, that stubborn, stupid macho insistence that he could control the narrative if he only played his cards right. But pride does not pay bills, and Doug found himself staring at the geography of his life and realizing how small he had become. If Vanessa divorced him, would he be left to pay off the debts alone? Would Joey, with his convenient pockets and sharp smile, expect recompense in some form? The possibility that he might be forced to shoulder the debt publicly to explain to lenders and friends and perhaps to the world that he had been less than capable made him feel exposed in a way that anger could not blunt. Vanessa's face, meanwhile, was a study in complexity. She had loved Doug in a way that had started wide and patient, and then narrowed into something that felt like a role she had been cast into. Joey had been an accident of chemistry, or perhaps the culmination of a long, secret hunger for someone to see her differently, as a woman with more mystery than the life she shared with Doug allowed. With Joey, there had been laughter and friction and the kind of attention that made bones feel lighter. But she knew the moral cost of what she was doing. She knew that walking away would not simply be a departure. It would be a demolition of a house that had been built on both faults and kindnesses. Yet she had reached a point where the scale of what she wanted had exceeded the cost she was willing to bear. Telling Doug she was paying his debts was, in a cold way, a recognition that she had been buying him forgiveness for mistakes he may not have realized he was making. The courthouse law and the ledger entries were not yet part of the night. The casino light insulated them, made decisions feel like they were happening in a bubble. Joey's smile when Doug left, because Doug left, not in triumph but in a kind of stunned retreat, was unreadable. There was a hint of triumph, yes, but also an awareness that the breakage would have consequences beyond the room. Joey was not a man to be underestimated when it came to leverage. He knew what debts could do. He had been the type who dealt with numbers and favors in the shrouded corners where people ask for what they shouldn't need to ask for. Vanessa's claim that she had been handling Doug's debt could mean she had been in contact with people like Joey, that she had allowed him into their finances, their secrets. That knowledge was a dangerous current that might drag them all under. Back at Derek and Ashley's, the morning after the proposal was a study in small, domestic miracles. Jan came by with coffee that tasted too strong and a casserole that smelled like the old Sunday dinners she had cooked when Ashley was a child. The house was full of quiet celebrations and pragmatic talk. They discussed flowers, a date, how to navigate the world when one partner's needs were different. Jan's approval was thorough but practical. She wondered aloud about accessibility at the venue, about the medical arrangements they might need, about timelines. Her questions, while logistical, were laden with the fierce love of a mother who wanted her child to have both romance and a clean plan. Derek, for his part, found himself unexpectedly buoyed by the foundation that honesty had built. The confession had been a kind of exorcism. The secret no longer sat inside him like a stone. Where there had been fear, now there was the small, steady work of hope. He started paying attention to the sensations again, describing them to the therapist in ways that were specific rather than wishful. He found himself waking at odd hours to test a foot, to see if the twitch meant something more. It was, in many ways, terrifying because hope can be cruel if it fades, but it was also energizing. He allowed himself to imagine a future where he stood at the altar with Ashley, not as a wounded figure wrapped in pity but as a man whose body had a story of return. He thought of walking down the aisle slowly, with support if he needed it, but walking nonetheless. And yet, threaded through the happiness, there remained the knowledge that life does not yield its complications easily. There were appointments to make, insurance forms, the slow, numbing bureaucracy that attends to the physical recovery of bodies. There were the whispers of friends who praised and wondered, the flares of old acquaintances who could not believe that she would choose to marry him. There would be a need for boundaries. Even Jan, for all her love, needed to be reminded that support does not always have to mean control. Meanwhile, Doug sat in his car after the casino, the engine ticking as it cooled, and tried to assemble a plan from the shards of the night. He called a friend, a man he trusted with the bluntness that only some friendships allow. The friend listened, the voice on the other end a low, steady current. He offered what help he could: legal names, a referral to someone who handled divorce support. But as practical as the friend's suggestions were, they could not put out the slow burn of humiliation that had settled under Doug's skin. He thought about confronting Joey, about demanding repayment, about dragging the affair into light and seeing if people would rally around him. The idea felt noble for a heartbeat and then futile. He did not have the resources, he realized, or perhaps he was too proud to ask for the kinds of help he needed. Vanessa, for her part, left the casino with a clutch of nerves that did not calm. She had not planned for the scene to escalate in that way. Seeing Doug there had been a shock, even though she had known the moment could come someday. She loved Joey, or loved what Joey represented: escape, passion, the knowledge that someone looked at her not as a caretaker but as a woman with unpredictable edges. She also felt guilt like a dull ache. The night had not solved anything, it had merely made the choices unavoidable. She knew, with an exactness that did not comfort her, that telling Doug she had been paying his debts would be a wound that could not be casually bandaged. It was an admission of both generosity and manipulation. In the worst-case scenarios, it could be read as leverage, as a transaction that had been bought and now demanded repayment. The threads of both stories, Derek and Ashley's fragile, hopeful construction of a future, and Doug and Vanessa's unraveling, under the watchful eye of Joey, started to echo one another in small ways. Both involved a negotiation of truth and the courage to tell it. Both hinged on money and pride and the thorny terrain where love must be distinguished from obligation. Each character, in the half-light of whichever scene they occupied, began to see the outlines of choices they either had to make or to flee. They all, in some way, stood at gates literal and figurative beyond which lay uncertain territory. As the days advanced, therapists and lawyers, casseroles and whispered phone calls, began to populate the margins of their lives. Derek's progress was uneven. A week would bring a promising twitch and the next a discouraging stillness. Ashley learned, with the sort of steadiness that feels holy in small hours, to celebrate the small victories: the day he could transfer weight from hip to knee with more confidence, the morning he insisted on leaning on her arm as if testing the idea of balance again. Jan, who had been fierce and tender, started to remind him in practical ways that did not humiliate. She would text photos of wedding venues that had ramps and level entrances and promise to book physical therapy sessions nearby. It was the soft architecture of love in action. But tension gathered around the other life like a storm cloud. Doug's pride made him consider actions that he had never imagined himself taking. And Joey, with that half-smile and hands that gestured as if he owned the air, watched the scene evolve with an appetite that varnished over with caution. He advised, he counseled, he knew when to hold back and when to push forward. Vanessa, drawn to the idea of a life less ledgered, started to imagine what it might look like to leave and not look back, to sign papers and feel the air of someone choosing herself. The tale set itself on a taut wire. Honesty led to a proposal that was anointed with relief and hope, while deceit or at least omission revealed itself in the vulnerability of a man who had been hiding better days for fear of being loved the wrong way. The other storyline taught a lesson that pride and debt and secrecy make poor companions. They unravel marriages and breed quiet, corrosive resentments. Their worlds, the domestic one lit by the low bulbs of a kitchen, and the gambling parlor lit by neon, were both moving toward a juncture where decisions would have to be made that could not be undone by apologies alone. Lovers and betrayers, debtors and secret keepers, all wore their anxieties like layers. For Derek and Ashley, the next steps were practical and painfully tender: doctors to call, a new set of expectations to be learned and relearned. For Doug and Vanessa, the next moves were more dangerous: conversations that could turn bitter, legalities that could force private life into public spectacle, and the knowledge that someone like Joey could turn kindness into weaponry. And yet the larger question, the one that hummed beneath both narratives like a chord waiting to resolve, remained unanswered. How do you promise a future when the grounds on which it is built shift under your feet? How do you marry the man you love without letting the world label the union a charity? How do you walk away from a relationship that has kept you afloat financially but deadened you emotionally? These were not questions with easy answers. They were the kind of questions that demanded more than courage. They demanded an honesty that could survive being told. On the precipice of these decisions, people acted in the ways they knew how. Derek confessed and, in doing so, traded a safer life for a scarier truth that had the potential to heal. Ashley proposed and claimed her love as something that was not pity. Jan allowed herself to be delighted and then practical. Doug watched his marriage fracture and felt the hot, unpleasant shape of shame. Vanessa considered the cost of leaving and the price of staying. Joey, who had been the catalyst and the consequence, watched and nudged, a man who existed in the margins where favors and debts were quietly tallied. The moments that followed between words and actions, between decisions and consequences, would be the ones that determine whether these people would find a way forward or whether they would be forced to step back from the gates they had just crossed. The tides of recovery and the quiet mathematics of debt had a way of demanding answers, and people who loved each other sometimes found themselves ill-equipped to give them. The city, which had been the background to all these small lives, held its breath.